announcement before we get started and the technology magically starts working. So tomorrow there's going to be a workshop that Ann Austin and I are co-organizing that's going to be looking into more of the practical specifics. It's going to be hands-on, so we will have some tablets and phones, but also please do bring a laptop if you do come, because we will have some tools that you can, open source tools that you can download and install and start working with and cleaning up data and that sort of thing. And so we'll be doing that in the morning tomorrow. The conference website has a link to a registration form, and we also have a quick set of questions that we're asking people so that we can try to tailor things a little bit more to some of the your more immediate needs. So if you're a student or other researcher, this could be a fun opportunity, and you can share your horror stories about data, and we'll try to find good ways to do that. So thank you. And then just want to introduce Jason Orr. He's a professor here, and he's going to be chairing this next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I hope I'm going to be chairing this next session. I swear we had all of this worked out before lunch. Mercedes Crosses will be speaking to us in a moment, but we hope. I thought I would say, given that we have a little bit of time, I'll say a little bit about my own personal interest in the subject of data collection and data curation. That will be the subject of this afternoon's session. So I'm an archaeologist here at Harvard. I'm a landscape archaeologist. I work in the Middle East, and my first publication was a study of Bronze Age landscapes in northern Mesopotamia, which involved looking at declassified intelligence satellite photography to find not just archaeological sites, but also some features beyond these sites, especially these linear features that were very visible from space, not visible at all on the ground, that represent ancient trackways. And I was able to find about 6,000 kilometers of these trackways. These are 4,500 years old. So when I went to publish this data set, the University of Chicago Oriental Institute Press allowed me to publish these as fold-out maps, color fold-out maps that went in the back of a very large book. This is probably not something that we're going to see very much. We don't see it very much now, and we're going to see it far, far less in the future, in part because we have the ability to put things online at things like the various archaeological databases that we're going to learn about this afternoon. So in my case, as a Harvard affiliate, I put my data into the Dataverse. That looks promising. Yeah. Where I can say that it has the Dataverse was attractive to me because, in addition to being an open access data source, it also gives you the ability to have a URL, a citable URL. So this is a publication. And I'm pleased to say that my data's been there. It's been downloaded a couple of thousand times. On the other hand, I've never gotten a single citation that I'm aware of. So
I'm working on it.
So there are some pluses and there are some minuses, and it's this sort of a kind of a work in progress. And Mercedes, being the co-PI of the Dataverse, she's heard from me about this. Anyway, we are live. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have Mercedes Crosses. She's coming from the Institute for Quantitative Social Science here at Harvard University, and she's the co-PI of the Dataverse project. So,
thank you, Jason. I'm glad it worked out. So yes, I will talk today. I'll try to answer the issues related to data citation, but I will talk in general about data management and data sharing. From a different perspective that we've seen in this morning. This is not from the archaeology perspective, but from the data science and data stewardship perspective. But we'll see that there is a lot of alignment with the requirements that I gathered from the talks this morning. So if we think of any scholarly research, the way from digital humanities to physical sciences, including social sciences, natural life, health sciences, we basically do the data life cycle, or the life cycle has a lot in common, right? And we start with some primary data, and even though in no means is a sequential life cycle. There are a lot of iterations, but we still we do something with that data. We transform them, we catalog them, we document them, we figure out what to do with missing data that was mentioned this morning, and how to do inference, so that we can end up at the end to explain the world, to explain all the way from social human behavior to natural, to history, to the nature, the natural environment. So all these means that we're building, we have a trail of transformations and analysis that goes with the data, and the documentation of what we've done, right? That to end up being able to have this knowledge in a way that it's sound and it can be it is reproducible and it is very verifiable. So just even from the beginning of modern sciences, even though I'm referring to sciences, this all applies very in a very general way to digital humanities and to any research done in a rigorous and following a scientific approach. But from the beginning of modern science in the 1660s, or with the 1665 in particular, when the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society was born as the first scholarly journal. The motto of the Royal Society said, "Take nobody's word for it." And this has applied to when we look at this data life cycle, research life cycle, that the knowledge that we produce, all these research outputs that we have, the predictions that we make, have to be sound in a way that you can demonstrate or you can verify that that could be reproduced or could be converged to a scientific truth. So, and in other fields like computational science, we find replication as an independent scientific experiment that validates the findings, right, that is the result. And reproducibility as the calculation of the quantitative results by others using the original data set in that project or in that study and the same methods. So in order to do that, you need first to have that data. I mean, now we generalize this. It might not be quantitative methods, but it might be any type of methods and transformations you apply to the data. So you need to have the original data to be able to provide this reproducibility. And in the last years, you've probably seen many of these articles that challenge what we're doing to say, well, are we following an approach that is at the end verifiable? Are we able to reproduce the results that we're publishing? I mean, if you think about it from this first journal, the one journal in 1665 to now 80,000 journals published around the world in all scholarly fields, there is so much research output that it is difficult to know how much we've verified a lot of the results and the findings from this scholarly work. So yeah, some of the papers in the articles in the economies, in this, so how science can go wrong, or this other one, self-correction in science that works, science is unbroken. It's trying to look at an optimistic view of that because what at the end, it's not, at least most of us are not, have no bad intentions. We don't really want to fake our data. We don't want to introduce bad calculations. But what we're doing many times is it's just difficult, and we can make mistakes. So having it for ourselves and for others, a way to be able to validate that is important. And because of, well, this concern, a group of scholars here, well, at Harvard and few other universities, had a workshop similar to this one, a little bit smaller, and we came up with these 10 simple rules for the care and feeding of scientific data. And this included, it's published in PLOS, is a sort of a guide or some guidelines that can help for yourself to say, even if you want to reuse your own data, what do you need to do so it's easier 5 years from now, understand what is that you did with it. It said, love your data. I mean, you can go and read it if you want, but the 10 rules included this: love your data, share your data, and share it as often as possible, right? We've been hearing that this morning too. Conduct science with reuse in mind, so think about that from the beginning. Publish the workflow, so read all the documentation and the, I mean, again, in different fields, that workflow might have a different form. Sometimes it's the code that you're working on, the scripts that you're applying to your data. And publish your code. There are places like GitHub repositories and other repositories that will allow you to openly publish every time you make a change in a script that you're working on, and so that we'll analyze your data. State how you want to get credit for your data, and foster the use of repositories, reward colleagues who share, and boost data science. This was a little bit self-indulgent because we're a group of data scientists, but just help with that. So, and then we took with another group, also a large collaboration, somehow in the middle of all these top co-authors. We also gathered in some other, in a meeting to think of how do we go to the next step of that. So we can do all these good intentions and do it well ourselves, and use the resources that exist to make data and code and the workflows and the documentation accessible, but we want to do it in a way that then machines will be able to use it. So that's where a FAIR comes from. It's the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And the principles are about how are you gonna, what are you gonna do with your data, and we include everything else that goes with the data set. And we're talking about data in a very general way here, so that when you're making it accessible, not only a human can download it, but a machine can go, another system can go and use an API, an application programming interface to get that data, and then it can also search it through those APIs or protocols, can interoperate in the sense that it follows the standards, so other systems know how to access the data and reuse it, right? And at the end, you want the data reusable. That's the ultimate goal. But to have it reusable, you need all these, all those other things possible. So that you need to be able to access it, and you need to have sufficient information in a way that you know how to reuse it. So those FAIR principles put a specific. This is in the paper. Says that put a specific emphasis on enhancing the ability of machines to automatically find and use the data, in addition to supporting its reuse by individuals. And then it also says that, well, data management is sort of boring, but if you think of it as it's not a goal, right, in itself, but rather is the key conduit leading to knowledge discovery and innovation, and to subsequent data knowledge integration and reuse by the community after the data publication process. So it's the way we should think of the way we do research in order to make the findings and the results more accessible and verifiable. I don't know if I want to go through all those principles, but this is in the paper in Nature Scientific Data Journal on FAIR data principles. But the idea here is that, so I was saying the importance of this findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is that the machine not only us, but machines can find the data, and it can discover it because it has the data sets have a persistent identifier that is registered in some registry agency that supports something like DOIs, digital object identifiers, or other type of persistent URLs identifiers that will be searchable by any search engine or indexing of a scholarly work. Right? It provides that metadata in the registry, at least a minimal set of metadata that describes the citation, that includes who are the data authors, in what repository is the data, and a few other information about descriptive information about the data set. And it will be accessible, so it could be retrieved through an API or protocol from a machine. It will be interoperable, sort of You can also, because you follow the standards, other systems can use it, will be reusable. And reusable includes as rich metadata as you need, or description of the data set, so others, you provide sufficient information for others to understand that data set. And sometimes for yourself too, because again, after 5 years, you might not know what the data set is about, or what it is. So, as part of all these work about how do we make data more accessible, how do we incentivize data sharing, how do we provide resources for researchers to publish their data. Here at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, about 10 years ago, we started working on a project that is called Dataverse. It's an open source platform that helps institutions to build a data repository. And the difference between the Dataverse and other data repositories is that it focuses on self-publishing or self-curating, so that any researcher or any journal or research group can use the Dataverse to upload their data, enter the metadata they have, and they get a citation with this digital object identifier that I mentioned, consistent with the FAIR principles. It's registered to an agency, to a registry agency of global persistent identifiers, and it can be searched by those agencies. It is also, I mean, the fact that it's persistent is that URL itself doesn't change even if the repository changes locations or anything, because it's again, the URL includes the DOI or the persistent ID. And all those things help to make the share of data more interoperable and more accessible over time. The data archive, I mean, the platform of Dataverse supports archival protocols to help archive that data, back up the data. And so as a researcher, you don't need to worry about any of those things. You don't need to rebuild a database or repository. You just can go and upload the data set there and provide enough information, and you can link that data set to the publication with the results that use that data. As part of one of the other parts about providing incentive in addition to the citation to your data set, which you can use in a paper or referencing your work. You could also you maintain control of that data set. So it's not just giving it to an archive and then you cannot do anything about it. The data set might have new files, new versions, and you can continue uploading there and decide what license you need to apply if you need, well, if you want to apply for terms of use, so for others that use that data set. And also we're building a community that is growing, as we'll show briefly. Now, after these 10 years, the Dataverse is widely used around the world. We're working with installations that are in institutions from 20 different sites or more. It's growing every month. But the Harvard Dataverse alone contains 60,000 data sets. It has contributions from thousands of authors from 500 institutions or more. And the community is also growing. We have, besides the developers here in our group at the Institute at IQSS, we have contributors from those other installations that are participating to the code. And we have also, members that are very engaged with usability testing, with documentation, and many other aspects of the project. So, and the Dataverse has implemented those FAIR principles, so basically provides that infrastructure already that it's sound and gives good data management. And so again, you don't need to worry about that part, but only about uploading the data and updating it when and adding metadata as needed. So one of the things I want to mention from here is that in the default when you deposit a data set is that it's CC0. This is open data, Creative Commons open data. But if for some reasons you need to have a different type of license or terms, you can add that to your data, for your data set. Or you can, in some cases, either for privacy issues or because you need to restrict your data for some time before the publication is available, or for any reason you can have the actual data restricted, although the metadata, we make it always public, and this is for discoverability, so that any search engine, any other, if you cited that data set in a publication, you can still find what is called the data set landing page that tells you information about the data set, even if you need to ask for permission to download the data. And it supports a bunch of standards like the Dublin Core metadata, the documentation, descriptive initiative, the DEI metadata standard. We're implementing now PROV, an ontology standard for provenance. And one of the other important things about Dataverse in general, any repository that can interpret a format, a standard format of a data set, be able to extract metadata from that format, is that then you can use it to do data explorations or to integrate with other systems that will help to visualize, explore the data. So here you have a table in a CSV format, in an R2 data format, in SPSS format. So, and you upload it, we process it, and get all the variable information, and then this helps to integrate with a visualization tool that calculates summary statistics for the data set, descriptive statistics, and you can apply some statistical analysis. Maybe more relevant to archaeology, you can, if that data set has geospatial information or is a shape file, for example, then it gives you the option to visualize it or map it in the world map from here that we've heard before here from the Center of Geographic Analysis. So that just being able to have data in a way that is machine actionable is an important thing to integrate with other systems and make the data more connected and create automatically visualizations like that, like a map from the data set. Here's an example from JSON, actually, that is using Dataverse and has one of the data sets that is a replication data set from a site. He knows a lot more about it than I do, but, and then that data set can be, well, it has also the map in world map, so you can have the citation to the entire data and any other files associated with the data to the Dataverse, and the world map will have the visualization of that data. And this anybody can use. So we're doing, well, all the incentive that we want to provide to researchers through data citation is not all fulfilled. Like Jason was mentioning, that how do we count data citations is not clear. So for now, repositories and publishers, we got together to agree on the data citation is what we call well, should be as important as other citations from any articles of any research work. So there is what's been defined as the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles that were defined with a large group of collaborators through the coordination of Force 11 organization. And we're working with publishers, with Google, and with other entities like DataCite to make the data more discoverable and make it count. There is a project that is called Make Data Count, actually, that will help to understand or to have a counter about how much your data has been used, but also how much has been cited by publications. This is not yet part of Google Scholar, but we're working with that to do that. there is a roadmap that is just in a pre-print form that we worked on for a full data citation implementation in repositories. So this is the work, and just to mention also that with Google also we're working with the schema.org. Schema.org is, for those, is anybody knows that? Knows about that? Is a metadata schema that Google and Wikipedia and others use. That, for example, when you do a search for an offer or for an event, you see the right side of the search results a specific offer, right? With more information, with metadata about the offer and so on. So imagine that if you would search for a data set or some type of data, you would have something similar, some information about that data set on the side. And this is because Google and other systems, other resources like Wikipedia, so understand that a schema.org metadata that is embedded in the page, in the data set landing page of repositories, and can display that in the search results. So we're working with Google to make that happen by extending schema.org to understand data sets. And this is the work we're doing now. And I will leave you with a book that I haven't read yet, but so I shouldn't say too much about it, but a colleague has recommended it. That says raw data is an oxymoron, says we shouldn't think of data as a natural resource, but as a cultural one that needs to be generated, protected, and interpreted. So I'll leave you with this thought, see if you agree or not.
Thank you to Mercedes. In an interest of catching up, let's hold our discussion for later on. Let's move straight on to AJ Turnitor, who's coming from us from MIT, where she is data librarian.
She's still humanities. Humanities and digital scholarship.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the organizers, Eric, Rowan, Jason, Sadie, and everybody else. And thank you for the morning presenters for a very lively and interesting conversation. I look forward to continuing the conversation afterwards, everybody. I am going to talk about contextualizing digital humanities, evolving meanings, possible future directions. And I will start that discussion by talking a little bit about data sharing in the humanities. A sad picture emerging when we look at the humanities there. And this is a research done, essentially a survey done by the librarians at Penn State, and they asked humanities scholars and scientists about their data sharing practices. And they received information about, probably asked questions about whether humanities scholars and scientists are putting their papers or their data sets into the institutional repository at Penn State, and the answer they got is almost exact, kind of mirror opposite of one another. So the situation looks dire from that perspective, and I wanted to pose two questions to this image. First of all, is it correct? Is it the correct way to ask the question and the way the humanities scholars interpret this question? Is it similar on the science side and the humanities side? Especially if we consider the fact that humanities scholars, and somewhat it's valid also for the sciences as well, but let's focus on the humanities for once. With little to no training in data sharing practices, and with a long tradition, actually, in fact, in not sharing data, but sharing the interpretation of data. That's the gold coin, and usually in the humanities field. So whether this is a poised or whether this is a correct question to ask specifically for those in the humanities field is a question mark I want to pose. And for those of us who are, whether those of us who are concerned about the picture that emerges at the end of that, at the end of that question, is that what are we going to do about it? It looks like a dire situation, and so what do we do to solve it? And in this paper, I'm going to try to answer, try to pose a question and try to sort of propose some of the possible directions that I think we could go into. And with that, since data is related to digital humanities, a big component of that is data, and digital humanities is a term that is kind of extraneous to humanities, like data is extraneous to humanities as well. That has been coined relatively recently. That's why it is digital humanities, and we're still not comfortable calling it just digital humanities. What are the DH? And even that question is awkward, isn't it? What is digital humanities? What are digital humanities? Because there's lots of definitions of it, and really no one has come up with a great description of it. And here's one. I'm going to make it, and on the next slide I'm going to ditch it. DH are computational methodologies that pursue research questions in humanities fields, including critical approaches to those same methodologies, depending on what data humanities scholars are using: text, artifact, sound, image, construct, or sometimes information, or sometimes a combination of either one of those. The methodologies they use and the tools they use differ considerably, sometimes considerably from one another. And also, as I said, there's no consensus. Some folks call it a field unto itself, but there's a field called digital humanities. It's especially folks in the UK and University College London, I think. And there's very good arguments for that, but not everybody agrees on it. Whether it's a subfield or a methodology within a field, so there's things like digital history, but there isn't a field like digital English. There is a very well-established and respected long-standing subfield within linguistics called computational linguistics. And on top of it, there's different humanities fields have different approaches to it, and some humanities fields are comfortable with it. History is comfortable with it. And maybe some faculty, some members within certain fields outright fields are not comfortable to be called digital humanities. So despite their profound engagement with technology, maybe not specifically this anthropology department, but at least I've seen one anthropology department that didn't want to be called digital humanities. And anthropology could be one, and media studies could be another example. Again, well, digital humanities was a term coined relatively recently. Previous name for it was humanities computing. And one of the important scholars who work in this field, Willard McCarthy, says changing the name from humanities computing and being popular does not really solve the fundamental problem. And so what is the fundamental problem, or what are the fundamental problems? I already mentioned some of them. There's big gaps in training. Humanities scholars themselves are traditionally not trained, working with data curation cycles. These are all new, relatively new things brought into our respective fields. And even then, often focus is on tools and technologies and kind of stays on that level, less so on the social cultural aspects of digital knowledge production. The big picture itself, it's less holistic in that sense in some cases, and therefore the research cycle, the data creation, curation, publication, preservation, and the long-term sustainability issues are not always tackled in the same way. And we have touched upon this in the first part of our discussion today, that a few of us have mentioned that mechanisms for evaluation of research and teaching outcomes for hiring and promotion processes are still not in place. We could change the name. We could call it digital scholarship in the humanities, and I like that term. Smiljana Antonievich, in the book that I recently read, proposes that term. Or we can just look at it as a richness in the field, and we're going to continue to debate the name for God knows how long. It's rich and powerful and useful. We should continue doing that without asserting our own description of whatever DH is. We could continue doing that, and we could also, instead maybe on focusing on the skills-based training, institutions perhaps could work toward establishing a framework that embraces epistemological, methodological, technical, and social cultural aspects of digital knowledge production itself, which it seems to me that requires an all-hands-on-deck institutional level, and sometimes even beyond the institutional level approach to the problem that is actually, in some cases, if we look at it carefully, what's happening, it's not a humanities-based problem. It's actually a problem that is across the board. Sciences are also dealing with similar issues. So in terms of the problems with evaluating digital scholarship, we've mentioned, I think Suzanne mentioned, the last one that's item that's listed here, but it has a history of good work that's been done to address the problem in evaluating work done in digital scholarship. Modern Language Association is probably the first one that came up with guidelines in 2012, guidelines for evaluating work in digital humanities and digital media. In 2015, American Historical Association came up with guidelines for the professional evaluation of digital scholarship by historians. And more recently, maybe 6-7 months ago, College Art Association, together with Society of Architectural Historians, came up with guidelines for the same in their fields. They begin to address the problem, but they're big frameworks, and if you look at the details, I can speak for the AHA's guidelines. It's in the name, they're guidelines. They really are not able to tackle the deep level issues with the evaluation that are still ongoing in respective fields. So if we look at what's supporting digital humanities scholarship looks like, this named it number 1 and number 2, but I'm going to start with the bottom, number 2. There's some institutional support, and different institutions do different kinds of things. It's all good. There's a certain institutional level support that comes from the library, certain programs, some labs, that depends on whatever institution one is in, that run workshops, seminars, and sometimes, in some cases, they do offer course development seed grants to certain faculty who are interested in pursuing a digital scholarship venue, whatever it is. But the one that I really want to focus on are the curricular support. Courses relevant to digital humanities, even if they don't call themselves digital this or digital that. Especially certificate programs, or for students who are next generations of scholars, something that's certifiable that they can put in their transcript, that's manifest in their transcripts. There's a developing support in that direction, or there's a development, I would say, that's going in that direction that is built up on that number 2 level institutional support. Now I'm going to look at a little bit of the history of this, supporting DH and DH in the world, and this is very old 2011 map by Melissa Teres, who lists about 114 centers in 24 countries back then. And the focus, though, if you still look at what's the landscape right now, the focus is in the United States, Canada, and Europe, and there are scattered digital humanities centers, maybe even centers or universities across the the globe, but the focus, again, US, Europe, and Canada, essentially. For those of you who are interested in, bring to stop the slideshow for a second. That's it. Okay, cool. A couple of resources to look at. So this is Europe-based area EU lists about 83 courses that are doing relevant from different institutions across Europe. This is a more global one called the CenterNet. So Melissa Terrace listed 114. This one lists about 200, and maybe a little more than that. So, and their definition of centered is quite vague, all encompassing. You could say it includes things like the text encoding initiative is in there, as well as the upright centers are also included. Okay, so specifically about the curriculum models, which I think is a relatively new push in that direction, and I think it's a positive move. And we can divide it into two, the graduate certificate programs and the undergraduate certificate programs, or minors or majors, as we would call them. And on that note, Alexandra Bolan-Hinanu from University of Toronto built this simply. It's not including everything. It does not claim to include all the institutions that have undergraduate programs or graduate programs within the U.S. I've added a few. The green ones are those who have both undergraduate and graduate programs. And the blue ones have either one of them, but not both. And the red dots are nodes of activity, but they haven't really nailed it down and established a digital humanities program that's certifiable, that's transcribable yet. Again, it doesn't include everybody, it doesn't include all the institutions, but it gives a growing sense of institutions who are moving in the certification direction, which I think is a very positive one. If we look at those curriculum models, there is a variety, but I think we would agree that there's some themes that are across the board in most of them. And they at least, for example, have the desire to teach programming, usually in Python. They have text analysis, network analysis focus, visualization. They teach database models, query languages as well, and others. And some of them focus on digital media production, and especially those institutions who have information schools nearby, but not necessarily just those. Focus on how to organize information, of course. Metadata is a key concept of it, and they make sure they teach their next generation of students those important topics. So formalized training is a move in the right direction, but it's relatively new, as I said, and it's not happening everywhere in the same scale and the same focus, which might be fine, but I think it impacts the same things that we've been talking about, that there's no standard of evaluation of scholarship, because this is all new and everyone's trying to figure it out in their own way, and there's rarely, across institutions, there are rarely connections, although they do exist. And it's still digital scholarship, not across the board, and there are exceptions, but still not valued so much in the eyes of tenure and promotion committees, except at least you really have to put a big fight in some cases. We heard that there's some happy stories out there as well. So the landscape is changing, but it's not where we want to be yet. Curricular models, have been thinking about this quite a lot. So there's a structure, there's an underlying structure to it that's actually, it really doesn't matter whether it's humanities scholars or scientists or social scientists. There's an underlying structure that's field agnostic, and we could call that research data management skills. We're teaching humanities scholars and everybody else research data management skills. We have to teach it. And on top of it, we build the field-specific training tools and methodologies that are ideally taught by folks who are trained in those fields, who understand the terminology, the directions, and all that. And that in that framework, again, we cannot just focus on the field-specific field aspects of it, but we need to look at the broader picture. That is to say, when these graduate students or undergraduate students, when they start working in these fields, they'll also have to end up publishing their work. And they'll have to think about data curation cycle from the beginning, and they need to be taught how to do that from the get-go. I have dug some in the asked friends and did some research and came up with two scholars, both PhDs, both working in libraries currently. And I want to show you the syllabus of Timothy Norris, who's teaching at University of Miami right now, who's teaching a field agnostic data management course, a full semester course. It's in the second year. He's in the second year of teaching it. I can click on this, right? And I want to show you what is in this that's field agnostic, and is it really that relevant to everyone in this room? In what ways? If it's not, I look forward to discussing why it's not. It starts with an introduction about data. Talks about the research data lifecycle, data types, stages, and formats, data storage, backup, and security, sharing and reuse, intellectual property and licensing, data curation profile, and then it goes into Git and GitHub, introduction in a week, I don't know. Probably rushing through some of these concepts, but it's useful. Metadata and contextual details, versioning, again, and Git, and software carpentry, introduction to R, and introduction to Python. Repository identification, that's not field specific. And then it ends with a discussion of semantic web and what it means to publish your data on the open web, and how to preserve it for future generations. Right. And so the future, I think, requires all of us in the departments and the libraries, research units, and the administration to think together about what we want to do in terms of teaching the next generations of students what they need to know for the future. So there's the formalization of DH training and establishing DH in the curriculum piece that's already in the works. That's great. There's also this piece that's training scholars in data curation and data publishing and sharing practices that could be done by the departments as well. Currently, at least the examples that I'm seeing, is libraries are playing an important role in that development. And research, I2SS at Harvard could be an example of that. It really doesn't matter who does that as long as some institution within a given university takes that role, is I think very important. And assessing digital scholarship and recognizing the value, of course, it has to happen by the administration as well. And once we do all of these things, and the promotion of the value of shared workspaces, like the IIIF framework, and promoting the value of interinstitutional field-specific or non-field-specific digital repositories, and putting support behind them, institutional support behind them. So when important work that Eric is doing is not, so it's not fun. Every year he doesn't have to apply for grants and things, and really continue working without having to worry about those things. So the value of these resources are recognized and supported by the institutions. And likewise, promoting, that's kind of the promoting open access and publishing and placing, again, institutional support behind it is also very important. Open access does not mean free, it needs support. And that support has to come from somewhere, and probably that support has to come from a consortium of universities. Harvard has a much bigger library than MIT does, but I know that MIT, almost 80%, more than maybe 80% of the resources that the libraries have to support the journal acquisitions of the institution goes into paying for the subscription fees every year. It's a huge, I mean, the research is produced by the faculty and in the institutions, and they pay back to commercial publishers, and the commercial publishers have to be paid by the libraries of each institution to buy it back. And the prices are growing each year, and it really has created an unsustainable future for all of us. So we need to say stop to that at some point, and hopefully fairly soon. And again, that requires not my weird pyramid. The purpose of it is to suggest that we all are in it, and we need to work together with the departments, research units, libraries, and administration together to solve a really systemic problem that doesn't only impact research in the humanities, but also impacts research just in the same manner impacts research in the sciences as well. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing this.
Our next speaker, we have Ishel Feniel, who is a research scientist at OCLC, who is going to ask us whether our data management and curation practices support data reuse. Ishel.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm actually going to start with a question just so I can get a sense of everyone and everything. I'm wondering how many are archaeologists who actually create or produce data in the field. Okay. And then how many actually reuse the data, reuse others' data, other people's data that you have not worked with in the field, other studies. Okay. And then how many people who attend to the data are the data stewards and okay, this gives me a good sense of everything. I appreciate it. So, none of those things, but I'm still going to talk about this area. So let's see how I get started here. Okay, so I can do that because I've been doing work in the area for a little bit now, and so this is the team I started with. Beth Yako at the University of Michigan. She's the one that I've been working on this project with probably since 2010, and I did a little bit of work before to kind of get my feet wet in this area with earthquake engineers, of all things. So the DIMBR project was actually a 3-year project that was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The funding ended, but the work continues. We have a lot of data that we're still analyzing. So this project focuses on data reuse. It focuses on the data reuse practices within 3 academic communities: quantitative social science, archaeology, and zoology. And so we partnered with the folks up here, one of which probably looks very familiar to you. Eric at Open Context, Bill Fink at the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology, and then Nancy McGovern, who's actually at MIT, but she was our person who we worked with when we were working with the social scientists and ICPSR, which is also at the University of Michigan. So today I'm just going to focus on the archaeologists today, particularly findings from qualitative research that we've done in the area, with those that have reused the data, those who are caring for the data, as well as those who have produced the data. So this panel was asked to cover a couple of topics. One was to explore the challenges in meaningfully communicating data to a wider audience. And there are many. We've heard of several in the morning. We've heard of some more things this afternoon. A lot of the things that I've heard in the literature that I typically have looked at have been from the perspective of the data producer, whether they were lack of incentives, time and effort involved, or just not knowing how to do it because they haven't been asked to do it before, right? They're creating data for themselves and for their work, not necessarily for others to reuse. Given my background in things, and my PhD is in business administration, actually, information systems, and I used to design and develop technology. So I've kind of been ingrained to look at things from the user's perspective. And I was perplexed by the fact that when I went to a school of information, and this was a very big thing in a library and information school, that people weren't wondering what data reusers' needs were, right? They were thinking about building the supply of that data and thinking about how to help the data producers such that they would deposit the data. Not necessarily, well, okay, so we're doing this for a reason, and that's for people to come in and reuse that data. Let's think about what their needs are and how can we meet those needs such that they'll come and use it after we've done all of this work that we've been talking about all day. So, so I've kind of taken things from that perspective. And so I'll start with that. Let's see. So in answer to that question, I'm going to kind of go over some high-level results from the interviews that we've done. And I've kind of looked at three things. So one is I was interested in the data, if you look at data reuse, I was interested in what was important besides the data. And by that I mean the contextual information. I also looked at things from the perspective of what was the decision-making process of the reusers. So what was important to them? How did they make this decision ultimately to reuse the data? And then I looked at kind of where did they go and get that contextual information typically? And so in this first slide, these results are really based on interviews with 105 reusers across all of these disciplines, 22 of which were archaeologists, 40 were zoologists, and I think 43 were social scientists. So what you see here are results from the three disciplines. I kind of looked at that first question, and these were the percentage of reusers who mentioned needing or wanting different kinds of context information. And so the charts are organized in order from most to least in the order of the archaeologists, since I'm here today. And as you see, data collection information and artifact information top that list at 75 and 50%, followed by information about the repository that the data's in, which is close to about 20%. And then that's followed by information about the person who produced the data, information about the data analysis that they did, information about digitization or curation, and provenance. And all of those were pretty much tied at around 13, 15%. This next slide, actually, is context information that archaeologists didn't mention. Since I run it across three disciplines, these were other needs that were mentioned in other disciplines that weren't necessarily mentioned in archaeology. Prior reuse was one, missing data was another. Terms of use, research objectives, and then just advice on reuse. Here we see the percentage of reusers within each discipline who mentioned how they were assessing or evaluating that data based on what I call data quality attributes. So when they were asked about their decision-making with regard to whether or not they were going to reuse the data. And you see here what tops the list for archaeologists are credibility, interpretability, and relevance. Now, followed by this broader notion of quality, which they use. Ease of operation, which for us was about integrating that data, being able to manipulate it or aggregate it in some way. The completeness of the data, as well as data producer reputation, and then accessibility. And then if we look broadly at the sources that the users relied on to get that context information, you'll see that some of these sources were employed across all disciplines, but to different degrees. And in other cases, sources were very discipline specific. So if we look at the archaeologists, what they relied on a lot were, and I'll talk about this in some of the quotes, is the data producer records. And oftentimes they had to search for or assemble these records on their own, right? They weren't necessarily easily accessible. They may have had to go to a museum, as well as look online, as well as call someone on the phone and say, hey, can you give me this stuff? Because I want to use this data, right? So, and that includes everything from photos to sketches to the artifacts to maps to day plans and field reports, right? They were viewing it for all of these kinds of things typically because they wanted to be able to, as we have been talking about today, recreate the data producer's interpretation that occurred in the field. There was also that they were interested in the data producer's publications. Typically, they were looking at that around to try to discover data that they wanted to reuse, as well as gain more contextual information that they may not have been able to get through these other means. And then they also relied a lot, we've been talking a lot about digital things, but they actually relied on humans, right? They needed to talk to people, as I said, whether they were original excavators or museum staff that they were talking about. And again, it was to get at the data, trying to discover data, or get additional context information about that data that was missing at the time. So in the interest of time, I'm going to highlight a couple of these, actually probably the top 3 types of context information that they mentioned, and just some quotes, just so you get a feel for kind of what they've said. So the first, starting with data collection information. And we define this to include anything related to how the study was designed, right? How those data were gathered. And from an earlier study that we did at a joint conference on digital libraries, we know that data collection information was important for archaeologists because it accounted for things, right? It accounted for the fact that the context was destroyed in the field. It accounted for the interpretations that the archaeologists were making in the field. And it accounted for the different approaches they used in the field while they were gathering the data, given their perspectives or their interests in what they wanted to do, given their research questions. So this is one example of the different approaches. So shown in this photo is a team walking a field site, right? And as this person talks about in the quote, he explained that the details about those field walks were important to him. And they were important because they impacted the data producer, so that person who's creating the data. It impacted what their interests were. What were they interested in finding? And it then impacted whether or not that was interested in him, of interest to him. So, you know, were they walking these big tracts of land and only looking at big things, as he says, or were they doing these shoulder-to-shoulder surveys and trying to find small things? So that knowing that up front kind of helped him decide whether or not that was going to be even a relevant excavation or survey for him in the research. We can think about artifact information related to data collection in some ways, and they talked about, when archaeologists talked about reusing the data, they typically wanted information about the artifact that was very in-depth. And it was typically found in all of these data producer records that I mentioned, and all of you know a whole heck of a lot more than I know typically about these, given that you work with them regularly. They were looking to understand and verify the data producer's interpretations that occurred. They wanted to be able to draw their own conclusions, right, about whether or not they thought the data producer was right in terms of what they were talking about. And they needed all of that information. So it was about interpreting that data and deciding whether or not it was credible for them credible enough for them to be able to reuse it, or reuse it with caveats if they decided to go forward and reuse it, right? They knew what they were getting into, right? And they were going to tell you what they were going to get into in terms of that data. So that was another thing that was important. So as this quote here describes, I asked this person what she meant when she said where in the cave something was from that was important. And I asked her to describe that. And this is what she gave back to me in terms of the importance of clear stratigraphy. Archaeologists wanted to know where below the ground the artifact was found, so they could figure out, the chronology of it, as you all know, right? What else was found with it, and where those things were located, so they can decide where those things occurred in time, whether they were at the same time, before or after. And all of this this was important for her in terms of deciding whether or not she was going to reuse that data. The other thing that was of interest, as I talked about, was repository information. So this was, typically this quote exemplifies that of the data reusers when they were talking about this. And it was really the reputation of the repository for being a repository, right, in terms of taking care of that data, tending to that data. And it impacted their perceptions about the credibility of the data. And it wasn't so much, as this person very clearly says, whether or not they trusted the repository or trusted the data. It's whether or not they trusted that the repository had the necessary context information that they needed to be able to make their decisions around that data. That's what was important to them. So it was these things like repository functions that were important. And for archaeologists in particular, it was the application of the metadata so that they could understand that data. And again, make those decisions around the quality of the data that I talked about. So that was the important piece. And so with that, in doing this study, I kind of started with reusers because no one was really studying them or talking about them or talking about their needs, which I didn't quite understand why that was, given, again, my personal background. But, as we know, that's only part of the story. There are multiple stakeholders that are involved in this process, which brings me to this second discussion point that we were given. Where do we see misalignments between data creation and downstream reuse? And so I'm going to refer to another qualitative study that we've done, where we've asked this question about where actions in one part of the data lifecycle affect things that occur in other parts of that data lifecycle. So kind of that interconnectedness. So this study, and the results of this study were based on additional research we did that kind of extended the DIFA project. So we interviewed data producers and reusers, both before and after the reuse experience together. We analyzed email threads between data producers and reusers and the data curator as that data was being prepared to be reused. And we conducted focus groups once that data had been reused. And then we also observed presentations resulting from that data reuse at a conference. So this study took advantage of a group of data producers and reusers that had come together to integrate and collaboratively reuse data with each other. And it was data that had already been collected. So what did we learn from this? The good news is repository staff and repositories can facilitate this process, right, in terms of data sharing and reuse through their work. And it was their work around doing some kinds of standardization. And by that I mean a lot of it was decoding coded data, aligning diverse codes. I see Eric shaking his head. I'm bringing back that flashback for sure, because this was more work that we did with he and Sarah. But it was about aligning these diverse codes around things like animal bones, which is what Data Producer 3 is talking about here. It's like everything, the thing that cracks me up is that everything is turned into intentional intentionally difficult pose. That's the perfect description. Intentionally difficult. As well as this idea of integration of the data, because it was coming from these different data sets, and talking about a great job they did integrating that data. And the key around this was this idea, and we've heard it in the morning, but saving data producers the time and effort of doing that prior to deposit, right? So that efficiency, although this was very human intensive, as well as readying that. And then on the other end, it's giving that data to the user and it being integrated so that they don't have to do the work of trying to figure out and clean up that data such that they can do that. One of the other things that we learned around, there are limits, right, to what the repository can do to reverse data collection and documentation practices that occur across different projects and different folks that are producing the data. And the one that came up a lot was this idea of Kane's two-layer system, which is widely used in archaeology and has well-described stages. It doesn't have guidelines for how that should be documented. So people would document it in all these different ways. So it may be that it comes out in one cell in an Excel spreadsheet or one field. It may come out, that same thing may be described in 4 fields in a spreadsheet, and trying to reconcile that was something that, again, the repository staff had to deal with. And you see in this quote here, again, it was this issue of time and effort. And it not only impacted data producers' documentation, but also the repository staff and the data reusers understanding and integration of that data ultimately. They kind of had to understand how they were using the system and be able to translate that into one way such that everyone could kind of get the same thing out of it. So just as repository staff influenced sharing and reuse, in this study we saw how data sharing influenced repositories and reuse. And again, one is the condition the data comes in. And those that are stewards of the data probably can get a sense of that and understand that, and I have talked about that to some extent earlier today. And again, it's about the time and effort that we're talking about in terms of preparing data. In this particular example at the top from repository staff 2, one coded data set of 20,000 bones took 10 times longer than a data set with over 100,000 bones that had been decoded, right? So it's that process, and who's going to do it, which is a question that I have towards the end. But it's also about the selection that the data producers are making. So in this quote, we have a data producer talking about, you know, trying to kind of debate and decide whether or not they should include a notes field that they had. And ultimately, this person said, yeah, I'm going to include it. This was important to the data set. We had another person, to all of our surprises, to the point where people's mouths were open, who just deleted the notes field because she thought, well, okay, it's not, you can't quantify that. There's nothing essential in it, she said, and so I deleted it. So she just totally got rid of it and gave the data set in, which, you know, it just, again, it's that data selection process from their perspective of what's important. So there's that selection that occurs that we need to be aware of. And then we can kind of think of the reusers, or the influence of reuse on repositories and sharing. So many of our participants had shared their data at one time or another with other people, other archaeologists. But again, this was unique because it was collaborative data sharing and reuse. So they experienced all of this together. And what that caused was them to kind of open their eyes to how their actions were interconnected with the life cycle and how that occurred. And it made them reconsider kind of their practices and how they can support the end goal around reuse. So with repository staff, it was the difficulty that the reusers had using CSV formats. and kind of trying to rethink that and think about whether or not there needed to be some kind of training around that, or even think about maybe we should use a different format. When it came to the data producers and how they documented their data, there were people that were like, I'm just using pain. I'm not going to come up with my own system that no one else understands. There was also this understanding that they needed to be able to kind of talk through their criteria, like how they did things and what they did, whether it was the sampling that they did, bone fusion or tooth wear. And again, in terms of coding, just stop using your code. This person said, I'm just not doing it anymore because it just makes it harder. So hopefully that you've noticed that we have started in one area in this research, which was the back end of the life cycle and kind of looking at reuse, but I kind of marched backward around that life cycle, looking at curation in that study that I just talked about from 3 perspectives of the producer, the reuser, and the curator. And now I'm kind of backing up and kind of looking at the point of data creation. And so this new project that I'm working on, again with Eric and Sarah, so now we've been working for a while together now, which has been great. And then also Ann Austin's involved in this, and Ron Boyer at IFR. So this is the Secret Life of Data project that we call it, Flow Data. And this examines data at the point of creation and documentation and management. So we're studying data producers who are actually in the field creating their data, documenting their data, and trying to get a sense of that and understand what's going on, what are some of their frustrations and issues. But we're also interviewing reusers. That would be people who would be interested in reusing this data later to try to understand what their needs are and then try to figure out what those misalignments are. Again, in this process, but starting at the point of creation. So this is the latest, so hopefully we'll be coming out with stuff in the coming years on this, and this will be a good one to kind of keep your eyes on. So I guess some conclusions that I'll make, just given this, is that for me, I used to say reusers' needs must be considered, and I've done that to a certain degree, but to a certain degree, people are now starting to use the word reuse. So I'm like, okay, well maybe people are starting to think about that end piece, right? In terms of, are we meeting their needs? Are we satisfying our reusers? So I've kind of extended that because I think it's important to now understand this interplay, right, between all of the stakeholders. And I'm only naming 3, right? Producers, reusers, and the repository staff or curators. But it could be librarians at universities that are interfacing with disciplinary repositories. Or if we think about the institution in particular, there's several stakeholders in that group that may be involved. So it's a matter of trying to kind of widen our view out on some of this and begin to understand that there are multiple needs around the life cycle of data that we need to consider. And sometimes they do things that are very supportive of one another. We want to keep those. And sometimes they do things that are very unsupportive of one another, unbeknownst to them, and we want to try to fix those. And so I think it's being aware of the fact that this is occurring, and there's this interconnection across these various groups. And so the second point, and so it's kind of how we do it, right? I think is the question there. So it was nice to do it in that, radical data sharing and reuse collaboration, but it can't be that every time. That was a long, arduous process. How can we get to it quicker, I think is the question. And I think some of those answers were talked about in the earlier presentations around curriculum and training around some of these things. And so I think that's something that's important to consider. But are there other ways? And the other thing is that research data management takes time and effort. I think we can all kind of acknowledge that quite readily. And so the question is, who should bear that quote-unquote burden? Or even the better question, right, how do we lessen the burden? right? And sort of, again, try to support needs across the life cycle, but kind of also move all of ourselves forward in the process as well. So with that, I'll acknowledge my large number of people that I've worked with that will be growing as I do this new project. And then say thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That last bibliography slide needs to come back somehow.
Oh.
Up there, that flash.
Oh.
We'll figure this out.
Okay.
Okay, it wouldn't be kind of a digital archaeology conference if some archaeologists didn't send us an all-digital presentation. So our next speaker.
So I told my brother that I was
No,
going.
not yet. I haven't met him because he's not here, so I have to actually look up his name. Sean Graham from Carleton University was not able to be here, but was kind enough to record his presentation, which I think we're going to be able to see. Clearly, he has some media sense, some design sense. So, with that, here is Sean.
So I told my brother that I was going to be giving a talk on rehashing archaeology, and he got all excited about that because he said to me, "So you're gonna be talking about drugs in the past? That's going to be amazing." And I said, "No, I'm going to be rehashing some ideas about digital archaeology with a group of people about reusing data and that sort of thing." And you could see him kind of shut right down. There's a bit of a negative connotation there, rehashing something, rehashing old ideas. He didn't see the excitement. So I asked on Twitter, as you do, what people thought I meant by rehashing digital archaeology. What would you expect me to be talking about? Figure out your title first and everything else will follow. Well, Stu said, well, perhaps saying the same thing that has been said before, but in a slightly different way, avoiding plagiarism. Ted argued for fossilized hash browns, which sounds yummy. And Lorna wondered if perhaps I meant something along the lines of rearranging, reconfiguring what it stands for. So I like all these ideas. I like all these terms. Digital archaeology is nothing unless it gets rehashed. And one of the things I'm thinking about was, well, how do you teach all these different things? These are all great ideas. So let's start with Stu's thoughts. Let's start with citations. And confession time. I've Googled myself. I do it. I want to see where my work is being cited. I want to read what people are writing. I want to see if people are engaging with me. That's a kind of reuse of digital data, right? My studies are being cited, ergo the work I did is useful to someone else, ergo it's being reused, it's valuable. But when you go deeper into this reuse, you find that it's a surfacey reuse. It's a bit disappointing, really, to think your career is filler for someone else's lit review. It's depressing to think that your entire life's work is just a required figure of academia, just something that has to be there. But maybe it's just me. Maybe my stuff just really doesn't engage with people and they're throwing me a bone. Well, I have a topic model of 20,000 archaeological articles from 75 years worth of archaeological scholarship. And I went to it the other day to see if there were any topics in there that dealt with reuse or reproducibility or reanalyzing in any meaningful way. And no, nada, ixnay. While we might revisit an issue from time to time, no one really seems to reanalyze anyone else's data, reuse it in the broader noise of academic archaeological publishing. Nobody is rehashing archaeology. It's a sobering thought. And part of the problem, it seems to me, is that we just don't play nice together. We don't really want somebody looking at our data, do we? In our heart of hearts, we're afraid of that. I remember as a grad student, I was working on a project and I was asked to sign a waiver promising not to consider other participants' data unless I gave them a veto over what I wrote. We see this same tendency, I think, when you try to force students to work together on a project. In a way, reusing data is a group project where your group members live in the future, and you just know they're going to be angry with something you did, so why do it? And will the data that they play with actually be the data that you left behind? How will they know that this is what you actually put together? In the current climate, we actually have to really be on guard for deliberate alterations or other manipulations. And that leads me to Ted's comment about hash maps. A hash, it's an amazing concept, and I'm still getting to speed with it, but a hash function takes any input you give it. The Library of Congress, Martha Stewart's recipes, data on XRD and XRF from South Arcturian stamped bricks, whatever. It takes that input, runs it through the function, and maps it to a particular value, so you get a unique endpoint. It's deterministic. So if the input changes, say a text file gets edited and something gets deleted, the hash at the other end is changed. And this is useful for security to test that a message hasn't been changed en route. It speeds up database search. There are many things you can do with it, so check out the Wikipedia article actually on hash maps. In the current attacks on rationality, knowing that our data has not been corrupted is going to become ever more important. I think we need to become familiar with hash functions in order to guard against malicious use of archaeology for political ends. But more prosaically, more down to day-to-day concerns, if I can put it like that, there are other uses. In my own work with Damien Huffer, we've been using Lincoln Mullen's R package for detecting text reuse via hash functions to trace patterns in the trade in human remains online. You can buy and sell human remains on Instagram very, very easily. I've got a collection of about 13,000 unique Instagram posts. I take all of that data, all of that text. I'm doing other things with the images themselves. I hash the comments, and then I use the script at the top here to compare for similarity. And it turns out it's a very useful way, it's a very useful signature for individual buyer and sellers writing patterns, even when there's no ID or other metadata changes. Be sure your sins will find you out, I guess. But you try talking to your colleagues in the department about this kind of thing, or you try it out on some students. This is the kind of look you get because, well, frankly, that hash tag text reuse, what? This doesn't look like archaeology. Which leads me to Lorna's comment about digital archaeology perhaps being a pivot away from how we've done things into the past to how we might do things in the future. Lorna's research is extremely important for digital archaeology. One of the things she focuses on is what might be called the consumption side of archaeology on the web. You know, what's lately been called fake news or alternative facts, but is really propaganda. The last few days, she's been looking at some pretty hateful websites to see how they've been using archaeology. We want people to engage with archaeology, right? We want them to reuse our data, but we don't want them doing this. So how do we stop that? Or how do we get people to use it correctly, or at least understand how we make knowledge from the past? It's a perennial problem of archaeological education, And it's got to be something that we do mainstream as part of our everyday archaeological practice. I understand digital archaeology as a public archaeology, as necessarily a public archaeology. So, all right, okay. How? Well, let's go back to that first problem of surfacey reuse of other academics' work by academics. You know, all you people who've cited my work and haven't actually read it. That's a joke. I love you all. Eric and I hatched a scheme last summer. We were talking about how do we get people to reuse materials, especially all of the materials in open context. So we thought incentives, you know, money, good neoliberal DH tools that we are. We offered real money up to about $1,000, give or take exchange rates. We promoted the hang out of it. We made films, wrote tutorials. We contacted instructors across the Anglosphere. We had very little uptake. And, well, it turns out money just isn't enough. And I think, or at least I wonder if part of the problem is that when we deal with digital data, we're dealing with sunk cost effect. You know, nobody knew how to deal with data in a non-proprietary format. All this stuff is on there on open context, but folks just perhaps didn't know how to do it. So much of our computational archaeological infrastructure is proprietary software. Software and databases for which we've paid licensing fees. We've paid so much money, we damn well make sure that there's someone in our department, in our company, who can use that particular piece of software. And because that department, that company uses that particular piece of software that they've paid lots of money into, well, it makes sense to teach that. But all this open source stuff, all these new formats, it's classic chicken and egg. And there's other problems. There's no culture of undergraduate teaching with actual data sets, you know, ready to take advantage of this opportunity that we put together. Yes, there is in particular here and there and with individuals, but as a culture in archaeology more widely, I wonder. And two, working with digital data still requires a level of digital literacy that we haven't yet reached. We're putting data out there, but we're doing a poor job in the teaching side of things. So take a look at what the digital historians are up to, in particular, people like Lincoln Mullen. He doesn't just do his research, he builds capacity for others. He shares it all. He's explicit about using his research materials in the materials that he's putting together to teach his students. And he provides, or he addresses at least, how to get your materials online in a format that others can then use. Ben Marwick, who is with you today, does this extremely well, and so as not to preempt him or otherwise get in his way, I'll just tell you, I'll listen to him very closely. I hide in the history department. I try to mix this stuff into my teaching with my undergrads, but I screw it up all the time. Part of it, that anxiety about doing digital work. If I can coax them through the door into my class, I really have to manage my expectations of what is reasonable in terms of a starting point. I've had students say to me, in my officially digital classes, if I wanted to do computers, I wouldn't have taken history. What if it breaks? What if it doesn't work? How do I get an A? I know how to get an A on an essay. How do I get an A here? And it's that fear of failure. We have not taught students how to fail productively. We've created systems where the risk of trying something different is usually catastrophic. Digital work requires screwing around. The screw-manutical imperative, as Stephen Ramsey famously put it. We're not good at teaching people to do that. And tech tutorials are awful, and I've made my fair share of these kinds of crimes. Tech changes too rapidly, and the kinds of machines that my students have aren't up to the task. I've had students turn up with iPad minis in my Data Viz R class. I end up spending weeks on tech support getting everyone's machine properly configured. My mom thinks that I mostly do tech support, and she's mostly right. So what do? Well, turn our teaching inside out. Do it in public. I'm not talking MOOCs, though I suppose they have a role here as educational tourism. I mean, put it all out there and invite the public to take part alongside our formal students. Do it inside out. Get outside the boundary, the walls of your classroom. Share with our students and the public what has worked and what hasn't and why. Share the fails. Publish the fails. Replicate someone else's students, and maybe don't publish the replication, but do the replication with your students, with the public. Said the white man on the internet. Your mileage will vary. But if you are a white guy on the internet, for God's sakes, use that privilege, get out there, take risks, make it safe for someone else to do it too. This is going to require special tools. I want to take away that burden of the sunk costs. I want to take away all of those tech issues. So I'm really pleased to announce that we've just won funding to build something that we're calling the Open Digital Archaeological Textbook Environment with Neha Gupta, Michael Carter, Ben Compton, and this is funded by eCampus Ontario. And we're going to take DHBox and we're going to add some more archaeological bells and whistles to it, and we're going to intertwine a textbook and teaching materials around this computational environment that you can access through the web. Build once, deploy everywhere, as they used to say. We're going to take our cue from open context, include recipes for different kinds of tasks. You want to use this for research? No problem. One-click install, or you can download it, install it yourself. Everything will be hashed properly, so you'll know that you've got a true copy. So I'm just going to wrap up now and ask for your help. We need case studies. We need good data sets. We need rehashed, reproducible digital archaeology. Digital archaeology, this is an opportunity for us to rethink how we do things in archaeology. It's going to be a lot of work, but rehashing archaeology will be delicious. Thank you.
But before I have our speakers come up to the front, one of our discussants, Barbara Fash from the Peabody Museum, is going to show us a little bit. So I'd ask Barbara to come up before the rest of you. So Barbara Fash is from the corpus of Myra hieroglyphic inscriptions at the Peabody Museum and is heavily involved in digital epigraphy.
And lots of other digital archaeology too. So thank you, Jason and Roland and Eric. This has been really interesting. Really interesting afternoon. A lot of variety in the presentations. And my personal experience, both in the field and at a museum or in several museums, and so I'm going to try to bring up my focus in a little bit to best practices and what happens when the data goes to repositories and how do we best use it. And a lot of the discussions today were about data that's being created right now. And a lot of us work with data that was created long before there was any digital media of any sort. And so how do we reconcile those two issues into what we call digital archaeology today, and how we reuse that data, I think is really important. And so there's many of the same questions I wanted to talk about in this panel discussion. We decided it would be useful for me to use some images and sort of be a hybrid speaker panel discussion. in this session. So I think what I want to discuss in my comments is something a lot of people brought up is sort of the skill sets that we need. How do we gain wider intellectual investment in archaeological data preservation and reuse at museums and among young scholars? And how should we structure future funding to improve the quality of documentation of archaeological collections? I supervise a number of ongoing digitization projects, not just the Maya hieroglyphic ones, but collection management projects here at the museum and at the Peabody Museum and at our primary field site in Copan, Honduras. And so I'll use a few examples from some of this work. So first, the skill set. I think a lot of us are on the same page about a lot of things that have been talked about all across today. And in addition to important data management plans, projects really should form a combined team that together can observe and coordinate the required skill sets to be used and developed for the data to be preserved and disseminated properly for reuse. So EC brought this out in her work and her studies, and I think a lot of what I have to say is much in line with her suggestions. So I think we need first the archaeologist skill set. They're the data producers and usually the data reusers. We need data manager skills, museum and archival skills. And then importantly in our work and in many people's work, I think when you work at a field site in another country, the training of local personnel. In many cases, your data is left there, or at least the primary source data or the artifacts. You need for people there to be able to manage the data just as much as you need people anywhere in the world to be able to manage it. But if it's going to reside in a specific repository at a local community, then the people there need to be able to know how to do this digital work as well. And we spent a lot of our funding that we've gotten on training people at the sites we work at. I think deficits in skills and training have been really plaguing archaeological collections in repositories like museums for at least 3 decades and probably more. And in field situations where collections remain, the situation is often really more acute than that. So when we look at where we want to go and where misalignments have developed, we have to consider where we came from. I mean, we're archaeologists after all, right? So how have things evolved to sort of get to a point where there is misalignment with data producers, data users? It turns out, if you look at this book, Recoding the Museum Digital Heritage and the Technologies of Change by Ross Perry, I think he brings out that it's been about 40 years and we've been really struggling with how to make computers less disruptive in archaeology and museums and a more positive interface. So there's a pattern in museums generally that he lays out, and certainly reading that I found that the Peabody Museum is representative of this pattern. In brief, in the 1960s and 70s, there's a shift from special interest computing to curatorial staff doing the computing, but it's still relatively confusing, and curators are not technologically prepared at this time. So a lot of that jargon that was being talked about by EC, that cryptic jargon was something that people would say about computers at that time. In the 1980s, programmers started to be hired in repositories and museums to interface for curatorial staff. And in the 1990s, sort of a split culture develops where data entry people and subject knowledge curators are starting to be separated. And into the 2000s, the divide actually widens, and academic and research is put on one side, and staff and administrative arm on another. So we're kind of overdue for a change again, which brings us, I think, to the present, where I believe we're actually starting to have a reconsideration of data management process in museums to reconnect the archaeological data with the collections themselves. So there's been a lot of webinars and things on the SAA sessions on how just how vital the need is to recontextualize archaeological data with collections. Many of the collections have been orphaned in the intervening years that all of this has been taking place. In museums, the emphasis on computer database cataloging has led to a decoupling of specialized subject knowledge with the actual object data. And as we know in archaeology, this can really be a serious permanent problem of data loss. So some of this unsettling shift in institutional culture and change in curatorial practice can be traced back to an impression that starts back in the 1960s, that it was going to be more efficient to separate the tasks of data preparation and data input that didn't really require the high educational requirements, and that this could be done by large teams of data entry clerks under the supervision of maybe a curator. And there was commonly the sense that increased knowledge would be gained by the people doing the data entry through their involvement with museum objects. But nevertheless, the split culture developed, and it still really exists today and contributes to this misalignment of data creation and the downstream use of it today. So a decade ago, Perry noted that as museums adapted to establish specialized IT units, documentation and registration roles, and data entry components, they were often encouraged to give routine reports focusing on things like the percentage of records entered and timekeeping and hitting specific targets. And there was a disregard often for perfection or inconsistencies in the data. And you know, we've heard this discussed today in other talks, and so the question is, how do we reconcile the two viewpoints? David McCutcheon, who started in 1979 the British Museum project to digitize the Department of Ethnography and of Records and Collections, said the data management wish for short inventory records and the curatorial, or in this case, archaeologists' desire for fully comprehensive records compiled from all available sources of information. So Teresa's Sardis work this morning, I think, as we saw, is an example of this today, and a really serious commitment to all the information being connected with an object. So one solution is to get a wider intellectual investment in archaeological data preservation and reuse at museums, and especially among young scholars. To safeguard archaeological information, both these cultures that have developed need to move away from a proprietorial sense of ownership of collections and their information and records, to develop creative and robust methods of building and representing the full knowledge of an object for multiple users or readers. Working as teams to migrate information and research primary sources for missing information. So from my perspective, the museum hierarchy charts that typically divide academic and research work with service and administrative staff are now becoming outmoded because we can see that it's rendering the objects collection in the museum dysfunctional, and it can undermine the very archaeological data that the data management and computer automation is designed to protect. So our projects of contextualizing collections in Copan and the valuable and vast Mesoamerican ceramic typologies of the Peabody Museum are examples of how funding resources, in our case, have been utilized to initiate these goals. Here you see a Peabody project. Jennifer Carballo, who's here with us, has been working on this for several years to recontextualize and bring information back to the really valuable archaeological ceramic type collections from Mesoamerica at the Peabody Museum. And former students and graduate students have been working with us in the field in Copan to recontextualize some of the data that's been lost in the process of archaeological data that was discovered back in the 1930s and 40s, for example. And this takes a lot of time in going to the original sources where things were published, and as people have said, field notes. So all of these things are really important to keep at the forefront. So another project we have in motion is for the Corpus of Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions, which I direct. And there's about 10,000 or so records in the form of photo boards that we want to share with scholars widely. And so I brought in Nicholas Carter, who's a Maya-pographer and archaeologist, to help realize this goal. It really requires a lot of in-depth research to create the full records with cross-referencing the original museum source and bibliographic records that might be associated with these objects. But it really is worth it because it renders the data infinitely more searchable and retrievable for requests. I should emphasize that one very positive outcome of these deep engagements with the data input process is that the researcher, in this case Jenny or Nick, they become familiar with the collection and they apply their knowledge to new research projects that can stem from it. And I think then they are able to help other people and other scholars be able to navigate that data even better. Also, we have work ongoing in Copan. There's over 40,000 individual sculptures there, and a database project there that has been going on since 1993. So, again, getting the local people involved in that process. I don't manage that database anymore. I have passed it on to Karina Garcia, who lives and works in Copan. And I think this, that Perry brings up a word of transcoding and new media where society and technology are reciprocally affected and coded by the other. So we kind of go back and forth with our data. And this is an example of that, I think, this huge project that I've been working on all my career at the site of Copan on the hieroglyphic stairway there. But it goes way back. It goes, there's data from the 19th century that we're working with in the form of glass plate negatives. And then, my original analog drawing that we're now digitizing and redoing because we've now made a 3D scan of the entire text. And we're now producing that in a way that we can work with it on a tabletop. And so, constantly the data is being changed and migrated in other forms. And so I think it's good to step back and think about how that's affecting the way we look at the data, as well as, just being able to share it with people. I think now that digitization and inventories are really already recognized as essential and they've become really fast, that future rounds of funding and institutional support should really aim to improve the quality of the documentation of the archaeological collections. And, I make a call out to institutions in places like Harvard to develop museum positions that sit at the crossroads of curatorship and data entry computing, to develop institutional projects that support postdoctoral fellows with subject knowledge to contribute to the data production of collections. And then create communities of practice. I think we've heard from
version of that from other people today. For example, groups within a university or the university museums or academic departments who share common concerns on an archaeological topic to add content value to objects and safeguard the transfer of archaeological data to a museum repository. And I think that, you know, one of the classes as taught here is archaeological research methods in museum collections. And right, it's more of a personal study kind of, or independent study class. But I would love to see that include more of what people have been saying about education and about, you know, bringing the information from the field to the museum or to a repository and the whole data life cycle. So I think that if universities and funders support this fresh mindset, which we really have to change the mindset of how we look at how data is produced and how it's put into our repositories, that we show that we value the archaeological data life cycle at all of the stages of acquisition, usage, preservation, and reuse. That students and postdoctoral fellows will be really enthusiastic collaborators in this venture because they'll be learning the benefits of creating robust, reliable data that they can use and will use. Thank you. And thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I would like now to invite all of our speakers from this afternoon's panel to come down and have a seat. Before we open up things generally, I'm going to introduce Dr. Gabriel Pizzorno, lecturer in history here at Harvard University, but also a fully trained archaeologist. Why don't you take the podium if you'd like to start things off?
For my second and third year as a grad student, as you may imagine, that didn't turn out well in terms of having a dissertation subject, so I ended writing a dissertation that was based on archival material. Archival material from a site excavated by the Hassan Loop project. You just saw a picture of it in John's presentation, the one that had the big ruins and the two little blokes. One of those was Dyson, Robert Dyson, the father of Iranian archaeology. I also ended up working on a much larger project, the Gordian project, 60 years of excavation in central Anatolia and concomitant archives that span several rooms, trying to digitize it, make it accessible so that people could actually publish the results without having to travel to the museum where they live to actually study them. As such, and because of my interactions with all those archives, I've always thought that if I ever had the chance to name a professorship or a chair for myself, I would like to be the professor of cruel and unusual archaeology.
You should have told me that in advance, and I would have introduced you as
But for next time, yeah. I think that Jason suggested that I ask a provocative question of the panel to get things started, so I'm going to do exactly that. And the question I want to ask is, how to put it? Are we trying to put lipstick on a pig? or let me elaborate. Is the framework upon which we're trying to build digital archaeology sound? We're a discipline that can't agree how to excavate a site, can't agree how to do survey, can't agree how to record stratigraphy, can't agree almost. So how can we talk about data use, reuse, long-term preservation if we don't have standards, we don't have ontologies that we can all agree or refer to, we don't have best practices, guides that can help us actually do things in a way that we can later combine and reuse?
Well, first, I want to say that well, there is also we can learn or be informed by other groups, by other research groups that do have best practices, have ontologies, I come from astrophysics, that's where my PhD is, and I've gone into I've been in life sciences and social sciences. And it's incredible, and hearing the discussion today, I was thinking a little bit about your question about, well, is there a standard? I mean, when you go into astrophysics and astronomy, most of the data sets in astronomy have the same format, the SIDS format, that you know exactly how to expect even the format of the data. They don't completely agree about a standard of metadata, but pretty close. It is the Visual Astronomical Observatory metadata schema that they follow. You go to life sciences, they have hundreds of ontologies. So every small biomedical field within the entire biomedical life sciences will use a different ontology maybe. So it is not a common standard, but there are many standards, right? And you go on, and you see different practices in different fields. And the thing is that there is still some common thing. You can still follow best practices by, I mean, I tried to introduce some of them today, but there are some ways that you can still give a way to be able to cite that data or to have a URL, consistent URL to that data that is registered globally and has the minimum metadata that we can all agree with. And that is just describe how to cite that data. So you could start with these small things, but then make those data sets be able to be found by other systems that are study approved.
I guess I would kind of go back to the second study that I talked about in terms of data producers being aware of the effect of what they're doing has on the other parts of the life cycle. And I take Keen as that example. And people saying, I need to change the way I do things because I'm noticing that it is having ill effects on people who need to curate that data and people who need to reuse it. So I believe that people are flexible in their thinking and are willing to adapt. I think on the second project that I'm working on with Anne and Eric and Sarah and Ron, I mean, one of the things that we heard in those interviews are, and we haven't analyzed the data, so don't rush me and ask me like questions specific. I don't know the answer to those yet. But I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, they're pretty open to help me figure out how to deal with this in the field, such that because all of them that we spoke with have said that they're interested in really interested in providing their data for others and interested in reusing others' data and doing sometimes comparisons or studies across geographies or times. But I do think they're kind of hungry for someone helping them figure out how to do that in a better way. So I think people are open to it. I think we need to figure out what some of those things begin to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have extra things to add, but specifically, we can talk about the same things. That a lot of us really, I remember the first time when I started my postdoc, maybe it was my bad, but when I heard about the term metadata. So I mean, generally humanities folks are not trained in thinking in those terms. And we have to start somewhere, and if it ends up being putting stuff on the plate, it is going to end up being that. And it's a long road, and it's got a lot of roadblocks on the way. But at least this research data management skill. Again, as I said, it's not just the humanities specific. I mean, we all have to learn at least those basic concepts, so we can start talking about data curation, data management, and data sharing. Those basics have to be in place for us to build something more sustainable.
Can I just channel Sean from Twitter because he just responded?
Yeah, okay. So Twitter's actually useful.
He's actually here.
Oh,
No, he just asked if there needs to be consensus on things like standards and if the underlying principles and processes are sound. So he's just raising that sort of issue as, is it really okay?
So just one up.
So can you tweet this at Sean for me?
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for offering a provocative I would respond to Michelle and Sean as a data producer, especially when you're a junior scholar trying to make your way in the world. You're so worried about your own future. It's really hard to think about reusers, and really you're mostly concerned with kind of planning your place in the world. If there was a currency involved in making data useful for the downstream people, and here I think citations is the big one, because that's the currency of academia. But that would probably make junior scholar producers of data far more inclined to think about reuse and what kind of forms our data should take in order to be reused. But here we might find ourselves in kind of a chicken and egg kind of situation where the reusers want good data, but the producers want some kind of payback. And who's going to start that ball rolling? And that seems like it might take a kind of a top-down authority, which is not, I know that's not what we like to talk about, is kind of imposed standards. But before I open it up, would any of you like to respond to that?
Well, I just want to say that I thought what Sean said about a lot of this isn't reused at all. And so maybe we should also think about who is reusing anything, and if it's really going to be used currently, or if we're talking about decades down the line. And so how do we make the data usable for people, not just right now, but down the line, and saving it. So I thought that was an interesting point by him anyway, that, and also he uses this chart, showing that certain people don't really even think about reusing data very frequently. They're so concerned building their own at the moment. It's hard to get out and get big data sets.
But the problem, I think, is also can you trust someone else's data? That's where the problem of context, I think, comes in. And in the case of archaeological data, that sometimes is very problematic. My examples working with archives were actually extremely I was very shocked by the fact that archaeologists in general don't care about the research objectives whenever produce the data set. That to me is extremely disturbing. And I think that has to do, and I'm going to try to one-up Sean once more, by going back to what do we mean by data? I mean, data, as Mitch pointed out in the last slide, there's no such thing as raw data. Data is a construct. I mean, it's observations about the world, but it's also our own biases. And if we can't control someone else's biases in terms of reusing their data, how can we incorporate it into our own research programs?
Wouldn't you say to some extent to what extent you trust your own data too? Because you have that bias.
More than most,
And
but not entirely.
But I think part of the point of making it, well, even the idea of making it reusable, even if it is not reused, is because you might care more about the quality, and also because there is it is more open, there is a chance of validating and find the places where it's not described enough, or there is not a method that is sound enough to trust it. And so it's sort of a cycle, right? Because if you don't start having a motivation to share and reuse, you won't be able to trust as much the data. So I think you trust it as much as it is when it starts having this transparency in the community.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, data's biased, but it's not just archaeology, right? It's not just in archaeology. It's social science, science. I think people want to be able to understand what your bias is. They want to be able to see your context such that they can understand how you got from A to B to C to D, right? And if there's something that's run afoul there, and they can't figure out why you're saying that, regardless of whether or not it's your bias, they're not going to use it. People don't think data's perfect. They don't necessarily want perfect data, right? They want to know what the limitations are, the issues are, the biases are, so that informs their reuse, I think. That's from my perspective in terms of understanding people. I think when it comes to your question about, junior faculty not thinking about reusers because they have to, get tenure and kind of survive the process. I mean, it goes back to also, it's not just managing your data for reusers, it's managing your data for yourself, such that you are able to use your data more effectively. I think we need to think, it's not just about them going out and doing it for someone else, it's them doing it for themselves, such that they're over time able to use that data, combine it with other data, collect other data down the line on that same excavation that is either 10, 20, I think I heard 60 years today. So I mean, it's kind of, it's that we want to start to talk about and educate people about. It's not just for other people, it's for them as well.
Well, that's a good point, because I have revisited my dissertation data, and wow, what a mess. At the time, it felt great, very logical. So let's open it up. I've already seen one hand from Dan Smale from history. Dan, did you want to
Yes,
make
thank you. Yeah, as Jason said, I actually am a card-carrying historian, although I'd rather be an archaeologist. I was really interested in this panel because it helped me clarify a question that I didn't know I had it really has to do with critical and digital archaeology, because I'm trying to figure out what the differences between digital archaeology and digital history. To give you some context for the question, I went to several of us in this room were at a paper yesterday about the calibration curves of radiocarbon dating, and to the extent that I could see the data behind it, it was totally different. I mean, these are not forms of data or ways of using data that are familiar to me as a historian. Here in Utah, and actually hearing the discussions this morning, and I'm thinking about not the data itself, but the form of the data is uncannily similar. And I'll give you an example. I mean, if you think of the four major ways in which we're analyzing objects. So we have the object itself and its qualities, we have its location in space, we have its relative frequency, and we have patterns of co-occurrence. Abstracted from the types of things that you're putting into those formulas, those work everywhere, they work in history. So I'm thinking of the faunal remains that you work on, Rowan, where you take and you sort them into into baskets according to the species. Yeah, I mean historians when they work with data do very, very similar things. I'm thinking of a great study of like Florence, where the guy is looking at tax records to sort people into quintiles of standings. Poor, upper poor, middle class, whatever. It's exactly the same process and it's generating exactly the same form of data structures. So the question is meant to be a friendly amendment to digital archaeology, because if what we're trying to do is build data structures that we currently don't have in digital history and are emerging and need definition within digital archaeology, it seems really important to do it together, because so much of the architecture is going to be identical. And then rather than hang separately, we can hang together. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe you archaeologists might feel that the types of data really are different and that we don't want to come together. I guess that's my question. It's for the archaeologists.
My question actually tails on this.
Okay, yeah, no one thought from it. Apologies.
So, and may not also, no, it is more of a specific question, I guess. So, to the point of the top-down approach to data structures in archaeology and some degree and in history perhaps as well, and instilling some degree of comparability between data sets. I mean, one of the potential major advantages of the trend in the discipline towards a digital data collection approach, and one that privileges effective database structures, even if data are being collected in a more traditional format, is decisions have to be made about how those relational databases are structured, even if everybody's doing it on their own. And moreover, it's likely to be the case that a good percentage of archaeologists who are leading field projects don't want to spend all the time creating a new database on their own, even if they happen to have slightly different methods than the next site down the road in terms of specifically what they're doing. And so when I've part of what stimulated me to have these conversations with Eric about this conference was being, as I mentioned this morning, about at this session where there are a number of people who are working on creating database structures for archaeology that can be adopted by multiple people, that are flexible enough, that are not imposing per se a structure on the data from the top down in every sense, but are nevertheless creating logical data structures that build on the shared understanding of how archaeological data work. And so what I've just adopted recently, a method for my recent field project that builds off of a database that Parker van Valkenburg up there in the back of the room was building off of somebody else's database within a group from Australia named FAMES. So this group is trying to do this, create a set of flexible databases that can be used not just for archaeology, frankly, but for all sorts of data, field data collection processes. And I think that as you start to have effective versions of that, and there are going to be many of them, nevertheless, they're all going to share some ontologies that are going to assist in this process of creating reusable data that have more understandable aspects of metadata associated with them. So kind of the question is, and one last thing, which is that, so I work in China, and in China, the methodologies are top-down imposed. Everybody agrees on the correct way, in theory, in principle. The correct way an archaeological site should be evaluated and approached, regardless of the time period, the location, and so forth. Now, of course, in practice, the way that is operationalized does vary from place to place, but also in that context, because of a trend towards digitalization of the discipline, you're starting to have database structures being introduced that will actually probably be adopted more widely, more quickly, because of the shared philosophy of how data should be structured. And so my question is, do you agree that a trend towards digitalization in terms of the practice of the discipline is going to have these knock-on effects of solving some of these potential problems in terms of that exist perhaps more strictly in legacy data, or more evidently in legacy?
A quick answer just to this point, because I think it's a mistake to talk about what needs to be the common thing, be the database, the schema structure, right? Because there is no need for within any of the fields in research to have a database schema that works for every single instance, right? And you may have your database that works for you, for your research, for your collaborators, and so what you want is the ability to interoperate with other databases and be able to take that data in a format, in a way that could be understood by those other systems or by somebody else that is not using that database, or have ways to enter data into there using the standard format. And that's why in life sciences, for example, biomedical sciences, they have built the ontologies. And so maybe it's just a terminology thing, but I think it's better to speak about the ontology standard rather than database infrastructure or schema standard, because it would not be the way to build something that is sustainable or preservable, or that is flexible enough for everybody. So if you think of the relationships in an ontology, you share that as the format to talk to each other, it's a better solution than building.
Ironically, it's the ontology that probably people agree less on, I think, in archaeology, right?
Well, that was my point.
Like, what's the context versus other?
Now, to answer your question quickly, I think that you've got a point in the sense that, I mean, computers are fundamentally stupid. You have to explain things in incredible detail, very precisely, to be able to get computers to do something for you, to help you. And the process of having to do that forces us to deal with our sloppy ways, so to speak. You have to define your terms very carefully. And in that sense, I think you're absolutely correct. This drive to, towards digital archaeology helps us having to really think very carefully about the words we use. What's the context? What's the strata? What's Anything?
Tony and then.
I've been thinking for a while since Teresa's talked about sort of the advantage that somebody dealing with legacy data has over somebody who's introducing a data system or data strategy to a new excavation. In that, you should correct me if you think this isn't true, but coming to a body of legacy data kind of midway through, essentially, like most of the cognitive strategization about how to organize the data had already been done. And so like our job was really only to impose a digital and relational structure onto it. But that was a data structure that was designed by very narrowly focused qualitative art historians. And so as a result now, it's great for art historical and qualitative kind of questions, and it's great for me. Like I love my database. Nobody else does. But yeah, there's a kind of declension of positive feelings. And I've been thinking a long time about sort of the problem, or not problems is the wrong word for it, but the issues associated with this tremendous social and financial investment in the creation of quantitative instruments when so much of our, when the individuals, the ancient perspectives that we seek to illuminate are individuals who I think largely exist within a qualitative relationship to their environment rather than a quantitative one. And I'm curious as to whether or not people think or might suspect that we're building instruments that in some respect actually remove us from or distance us from an ability to see that ancient perspective from a more qualitative perspective.
It seems like a lot of these issues can be resolved by your classes.
Just to add one point to it, I know an archaeologist at UT Austin that I read who was engaged in the creation of an ontology. It's a lot of work, it's hard work, and he wanted an EH grant to get other archaeologists together to work on an ontology. It's a lot of work in the end. I think it's likely that it will fail, that we will have folks who will disagree on the ontologies all the time. And the more complex the data gets, disagreements have to happen. And linked open data is supposed to be an antidote to this. Eric can talk more about this. But even then, when data gets more complicated, more complex, and more detailed, going beyond the who, the when, the what levels, and more further details, then it gets harder and harder to standardize data across the board, the definition of data, and sort of the values that will go into the columns. So it's really hard work, and I don't know if it's standardization is the way to go. Maybe linked data is the way to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you our last point before we break. So
Okay, so that was getting into my kind of question about this for you guys. That, so we had some discussions about standards and whether or not we're putting lipsticks on pigs and stuff like that in this sense. And I think it's really provocative. It's one of the interesting things. So one of the questions for the panel is going to be, and this is paraphrasing Stalin. That's why is quantity has a quality all its own, I think is what he said about like, big mass armies and stuff like that. So quantity has a quality all its own. Is the only value in doing this kind of stuff with imposing lots of standards, having homogeneous data, this sort of big, giant data sets that are all homogeneous, and where's the value in the friction between different ways of organizing and conceptualizing the data and trying to reconcile across that with that friction? Is that also an interesting kind of a thing? And is that something that we should also value? In that project that AJ just mentioned, Adam Rabinowitz and Ryan Shaw centering on this project called Period O, which is trying to balance some of these issues, where it's not just building an ontology that forces consensus, but building a common data model to express disagreement. about how periodization works. And that's something that would relate to the historians in the room too, that, you know, everybody, lots of people in this room are interested in periodizing, organizing things chronologically and spatially, but we all disagree about how to actually, what those specifics are, but the common data model might be something that would be a way of expressing these disagreements in a more formal way that can lend itself to computation. So, we'll kick it off.
Just very quick, just want to make sure that even though I work on standards and I think ontology is important, I think we're probably defining ontology a little bit different, but we can talk about that later, which is a problem of talking about it in the same language, right? That's different fields. But I think the most important is to start small and do what you can do. So I don't think there is no value in doing some things already that explain your data, even if it's not following a standard, or make it more open, even though then it can be improved data.
I'm going to try to answer your question by saying I think that, to me particularly, the solution to those tensions in the process of actually coming up with an ontology, defining your terms, is the most interesting aspect of it. I can certainly see how much fun it would be to play with a massive data set of all archaeological data ever collected, you know, test after good to your heart's content. Which, I'm like, to me, the intellectual challenge of reconciling all that is what makes it really interesting. And it helps answer Tony's question as well. In order to be able to compare how people see the world, you need to be able to define those terms. That's part of the job, maybe a bit of a grandiose way to define the job of ontology. The project that Dan and I are working on right now tries to do that by creating an archaeological database of textual objects that are described in medieval inventories. And we're trying to find ways to compare that to excavated objects. And the big problem we're trying to solve is defining the correct domain ontologies for archaeological data and the folk ontology that informed those descriptions in the medieval inventories. Because that translation is what can make that work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Like, the way we describe objects, it's not the same as the way people describe them. So, yes, it's the interaction I think that makes it interesting.
Any other last comments from
Yeah, I'd just like to say too that I think we can learn a lot from libraries that have already been working with metadata for a long time, and that you know, your experience of what's needed in data sets, you've already got a coding system, and we already use it in libraries. And so I think learning from that and building on it would be really instructive, for one thing. And then I think that we have to keep, we can talk about standardization, but that if we get too standardized, will we ever get creative again, or we'll get sort of stagnant in that spot? So we need to kind of leave one door open, at least. We can do projects like yours, and other people use data, but it's not all going to match. I think that would be really difficult to achieve.
Well, let's break here. Join me in thanking the panelists in the discussion.